last time we went through the process of creating an actual sticker sheet that's there. Today we're going to refine that and go from actually the sticker sheet that we had to building our first components. And so we're going to be actually talking about the best ways to approach building those components, how to actually lay them out, how to potentially set up your pages to provide a good documentation or organization of your libraries. In addition to that, we have also got a special guest today, which I am very excited about. We have Joey Banks on the stream, who, if you don't know, Joey Banks is the community superstar over here at Figma. And anytime literally any company releases an update to their design systems, Joey Banks will spend that night or whatever recreating their entire design system in Figma. I don't know how he does it, and it will launch in the community. It's absolutely incredible. Whether it's Apple to Tesla to who knows who else, those design systems will be up there, and it's just truly amazing. So we are very spoiled to have him on stream today. Thank you, Joey. We'll also be having an AMA at the end. Please, please, please go ahead and use that question and answer button inside of Zoom and add your questions there as we're talking. We're going to address all of those questions at the end, and we'll try and actually hit the best ones that we can find. We probably won't be able to hit all of them, but we'll try and get the ones that are really meaty and we can dive into.
Awesome. And just as we kick off here, just a quick housekeeping piece. Yes, this session, it will be recorded and available on the Figma YouTube channel. If you weren't able to join us for the first episode of Building Blocks, that is posted on the YouTube channel. This one will be posted shortly as well. And as Jacob said, please remember to use that Q&A button, set that chat to everyone. And most importantly, please be kind. We do have a code of conduct here. We can just really sum that up as be kind. All right. Shall we dive in?
Let's do it.
All right.
Go straight into where we left off last time.
Yeah, so just a quick recap for everyone. Last time, we are setting out on an adventure of how do we get started in building a design system? And we talked a lot about doing an interface inventory. We have our existing Figma website here. We don't have anything such as like components or rules about how things are used. So as we went through our Figma website, there were some inconsistencies in things, and we went through gathering a lot of our screenshots, going through our entire Figma web experience. And that brought us into a collection here where we started to break down what were some of those reusable pieces of UI that we found across the Figma site. We started breaking these into categories on some of the most common things. And towards the end of our first session, we started to introduce the concept of a sticker sheet, starting to lay those components out side by side in the different states. We started to create some color ramps here. Jacob, do you want to share a little bit more on the color ramps and where we started with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can see here, the only ones that we were really targeting during that last session were both purple and green. And one of the interesting things that I recommended last time is actually to leave space in your naming. So you'll notice here we have the purple 100 and it jumps to 300 and then to 500. That's a little trick I use whenever I'm setting up new design systems, just to leave yourself space to grow. And later on, what we did is Chad and I went through and refined this a little bit and updated this file just to skip over those portions. And if we see here, what we had is, well, it was previously just the 3 layers. We realized that those weren't enough to really provide the guaranteed contrast ratios that we needed, as well as the other interaction states, things like hovers, active states, etc. So we expanded out the ramps a little bit. We now have our 100 to our 500 colors, and we also added our neutral ramp inside of there as well. So now we can see we have the gray 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. And Chad, I think we also updated our buttons a little bit.
We did. So we brought over our buttons from last time, and so we could start to take a look at them. And as Jacob was saying, this is where we really learned that we had some inconsistencies in colors and how things were treated. Additionally, we started to think about, while we don't do it today, what if we had situations where we were using our primary and secondary button next to each other? And it's not a very clear priority order here. What is your primary action? What is the secondary action? So we started to take these opportunities to see, how can we refine and make it feel more cohesive? Now, similar to what we would do, working with our teams, it's been a few weeks since we last all talked. So Jacob and I, we went heads down, we went working and getting feedback from all of the product teams that were going to end up using the system. And we started to build out that color ramp here. We also realized with that color ramp, we have some error states in our what will be our components that we needed to account for. So we decided to also create a red ramp. Now, we found a very handy plugin in the Figma community called Atomic Style Guides. It helped us take all of the styles we were creating and generate out a handy grid so we could really see everything side by side. We also did the same thing here with our text. So we started to create some of those text styles. And Jacob, do you want to talk a little bit about the color styles and how we've now filled this out a lot further? Why did we decide to name them atomically like we did here?
Yeah, absolutely. So what Chad is asking when he's saying atomic is that these colors are named after the hue that they actually represent. So things like green or violet or red. There's another type of color naming system that's there that's often used as well, and that's semantic naming. What semantic naming is naming the color after the use that it's actually going to be used for. For example, button background, like a color button background, for instance, or a color text brand, something like that. And what I recommend is that when you're just starting out, go for the atomics first and get those as a baseline. And the reason why is it allows you to easily compare between different hues that are there. And so you can set up a very consistent color system first. Later on, what you can do is you can map those semantic colors to your atomic colors. So for example, your brand text uses, maybe it's green 300 or something like that. And then you have a much more consistent system moving forward. But since we're just starting out right now, atomic is the way to go when you're laying the foundations of your design systems.
Awesome. So once we started getting those colors in there, we went and we started to actually create a full sticker sheet based on everything we pulled out of our audit. Now we can see, Jacob and I, we got some feedback from the teams who were using just some of these, rough designs. And, a lot of feedback we got was what we expected, hey, we don't know when we should use a secondary button next to a primary. They both look the same. So we decided that, let's experiment with following the same color scheme. We also found that if we look at our previous buttons, we had some inconsistencies here where, here we had 48 pixels. On hover, our buttons were growing to 51 pixels. Also between them, our hover states weren't consistent. Here we got to a lighter shade. Here we got to a darker shade. So we just really wanted to shore it up and create a bit of consistency. And we opted to go for darker shades on hover here. It just ensures even more contrast. We also aligned all of our sizes of our buttons. So that way we ensured we had, enough tap affordance on here. And in this very early state, we're really only focusing on what is it going to look like for the pseudo selectors of, your basically your default, but then your hover and your active, and also the inactive state or the disabled state for the button. We haven't gone as far yet into getting into like what our focus visible may look like for any type of keyboard interaction. Again, we're very early in our exploration here. So we're just focusing on some of the upfront ones in this version of our sticker sheet. So as we take a look, we also then circulated this around. Jacob did an excellent job of selling this sticker sheet to our product teams and find out how they may be able to use these. And we've gotten some really good feedback to where I think we can get started in actually starting to build some of these as components. So then we can really have teams test it out and see, how they would use components as we start to build our very first library.
Yeah,
So,
and this is definitely the fun part for me. Like I love just diving in and starting to build this stuff.
so I think that a question, as a designer advocate, a question that I get a lot from teams is, where do I begin when I start thinking about my component architecture? There's guides out there that will tell me that, hey, I should just create a base component with every single permutation that let's just say for today, let's just focus on our buttons because that's likely going to be the most used component in your design system. I might want to create a base component of every single possibility that my buttons could be. At the same time, there'll be, no, you might just want to actually visually see everything that's there. So you might want to create an individual variant for everything. You might want to do a mix of that. You might want to create a base component and then create variants for that, which then you might want to nest other things and other things. And we're getting way too far down the rabbit hole there for really starting out here. So let's take our buttons, for example. I'm gonna actually take these out of our sticker sheet here. I'm just gonna create some duplicates because as you see, we haven't really done any type of naming or anything yet. This is still just our frames. We set these up last time where myself, I'm a fan of a frame first approach. I don't like to use a rectangle as a background and then, putting text on that and grouping or framing things. I just like to dive right in with auto layout from the beginning. Now, as we're going to start on making these components, something I want to make sure we don't forget about is in our audit here, we had some icons across our site as well. So we have a couple different things here where we can have an icon to the left of the label. We can have an icon to the right of the label. So we need to build those out as well. So Jacob, how do you tend to start approaching this when you're going to build things out? If we take the icons as an example, do you have any recommendations around using icons nested within a button?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is start with an icon set. I mean, that sounds silly, but there are so many community resources out there. And for this project here, we just went and grabbed a community set of these icons. It is a great way to have a starting point to just have a consistent set of iconography that'll present all the different pieces of information that you really want that's out there. There are tons of those resources on the community, and there's a bunch of open source ones as well that are really permissive. So I'd recommend starting there first. The next thing though is, Chad, if you go and inspect one of these actual icons that's here and expand that out a little bit. So this is a component that is an icon here. And one interesting thing about this, you'll notice that no matter which one of these that Chad expands, what you'll see is that the sublayers are all named the same, and it is a single vector layer that's there. The reason why this is a very good and very important architecture for icons is that it means that when you're switching overrides as you're switching icons out, those overrides will actually transfer between those icons. So do Figma a favor, name those layers the same, have the same architecture for each of your icons, and those colors will transfer over as you're swapping icons out. And I think we can see this in action. Should we start building some components here and adding those icons in?
Yeah, let's do that. So we're going to use our local components because we've included our icons in this sticker sheet file for getting started. When you're really first starting out building something, you don't need to worry yet about, should I have my styles in one library? Should I have my components in another, icons in another? When you're really just starting out and you're starting with that subset of components, it's totally fine to do it all in a single library file, especially when you're just testing and building this from the ground up. So I'm going to go ahead. Jacob, I think we should probably use like a placeholder in all of these since we're going to want people to be able to switch it out for their own icons, right?
Totally.
Let's just use this. We'll use this crop, or let's use, do you want to use broken image or crop? What are you feeling?
I'm leaning towards the camera icon. I don't know. I like it. It's boxy. It's fun.
Add a photo.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
All right.
Honestly, it doesn't matter what icon you're starting out with here. The important thing is that you're getting the sizings right, that you're understanding how that button consumes icons, etc. So have fun with that starting icon if you want.
Now we can also see that this icon, it already has our style of a black selection color here. I'm going to change this for in the button here, and we're just naming this white for now. And then I'm just going to copy this and paste it, paste it, paste it. Let's shift that over and hit my arrow key to shift it. So great, I've got that version of it. I'm going to move these down a little. Jacob, do you want to work on the secondary buttons and I'll do our primaries here? I'm just going to create these. Let's get rid of the icon here. And we have an arrow on the right. So I'm just going to shift this over and I'm going to change this to use an arrow. So now I have an arrow here. Let's just do this here. Now, if I were going to set up like a base component, I would start with something like this setup. For getting started, I don't recommend doing it though. I recommend that, creating the different variant for each, because you're really optimizing for who is using this library when we eventually build it. The least amount of nesting in there, the better the consumption experience for teams. It may make a little bit more work for you as a maintainer or a builder of your library file. Personally, Jacob, I'm not sure what your thoughts are, but personally, I'd rather take on a little bit of additional maintenance work on my side to make it easier for the users of the library.
Yeah, you really have to think about the cost kind of benefit analysis of this as you're building this out. If you are a single design system manager and you're maintaining these libraries for 100 people, 1,000 people, even doing like another hour here and saving somebody 5 seconds in switching these things out and customizing these things can result in huge savings across all of your designers' time. So really put some extra effort into here to making those things really usable and consumable.
Cool. Now, another thing we're going to do is, right now, just everything is still named as frames. And we also haven't gone through here and really set up. We can see if we look over in our selection colors, we're still just using the hex values for all of these. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select all of these we've created here. And I've started with the icon. I've used this, but I'm going to go ahead and use selection colors just to start updating everything to actually use the colors from our library. Now here, this is a good thing to note as you're starting to document your styles as you're creating them. You may not always know what they are, so it can help to use the description field as you're creating a style. So here I can see that on green 300, I've entered the hex value. So just on hovering, I know I'm going to assign this green 300. Versus here on this darker one, I have to guess a little bit because I haven't added that. I have what the CSS variable will be for it, but I don't have the hex. So we can see there, I guessed the wrong one. So I'm going to go ahead, change that to 500. And this one, we're going to set at 200. So I've now set these all up to be using our styles from within the library here. All right. Now, another thing that we're going to do is we're going to start setting these up to actually be components. Now, a couple ways we can do this. We could create each of these individually. We could just hit this here and create a component or use the keyboard shortcut. We could go ahead and we could select all of these and make all of these their own multiple individual components. Or we could jump right into starting to set these up as variants. And I think that as you're getting started here, you can absolutely start out with creating your big component set and variants. But to save you, well, actually, let's just show you what happens. Let's just do this here. I'm going to just take my primary buttons. Let's see, Jake, have you already gone in and added styles here as well? Looks like most of them.
So those should all be updated with the styles and good to go there. Oh, I did not do my white.
All right, there we go.
There it is.
So we could take this here and we could just say, great, let's create a component set. And awesome, we have a component. But if we look here in our variants panel, we have a single property and a lot of frame names. So this could be a bit unwieldy for us to go back and fix things. So let's undo that. What I like to recommend here when you are starting to build out components and variants, just make a little note for yourself on the canvas on how you want to name each of these things. So like a good thing I might like to think here is, hey, this is going to be, it's going to be the, let me left align this here. It's going to be our button component. Then we might say, okay, it's going to be button. What type of button is it? Or, we said it was priority earlier. Since we're just starting out and we don't necessarily have this on the code side yet, we might name it whatever we want to. Ideally, we're going to be working with our developers who are going to build this out on the code side eventually and build a code library. Or maybe there's a code library already that we can look at aligning naming. Either way, we want to make sure that we're starting to set this up for what it could look like in the future. So maybe we know through talking with our developers, we're going to call this, instead of type, since that is already an HTML attribute, maybe we are going to say it's going to be called button priority. And then we're going to have an icon. And let's do our state then next, right? We want to do state next, Jacob?
Yeah, I'm in representing state there.
State, then icon. Oh, you're doing icon before. Okay, cool. Icon before, icon after. So we can start to think of how are we going to name all of these? And we can then start to think, what things do we want to maybe make? So I'm going to say that this will be true, false. So because we can set this to be a boolean and just let people choose with a toggle if they want an icon or not. Hint in Figma, if you use true or false when creating a variant in a component, it will give you the toggle. You can also do on, off, and yes, no for that. So now that we've got this a little bit here, and Jacob's already given a little bit here on some of the naming, we can actually go in here and I'm going to select all, and I'm going to use rename, which I'm going to hit Command R, and I'm going to rename all of these layers to start following how I started setting this out. So it's going to be button, button priority, state, and then we'll do icon, or let's just set them all for right now. I'll just do icon B, icon A for now. So I'm going to rename all of these. And I'm doing it with slash naming here. If you're familiar with creating slash names in Figma or other design tools as well, it starts to create nesting for you. And as we start to build these as components and start building variants, it's going to help us in creating what each of those properties are. So we just started a little bit there on creating it. So now I can go back in here again and I can rename, and I can match button priority and just change it to, do we want to call it primary? So I can rename that. I can do the same thing here where I can go button priority and I can replace that with secondary. I can now go here, take all of these, and I can just very quickly begin to start naming things here. So here we might want to replace state, which I did. Did I put state in my naming? I did.
It should be, yeah.
I just want to make sure I did put it in there. So state will replace that with, we're just going to call it default. And then we'll do the same thing. Jacob, do you want to do our other states here as well? We can kind of tackle this together.
I'm actually gonna let you do it, as I'm nervous about my naming here. This is a trick that I just learned from Chad. And this like blows my mind around setting up your naming ahead of time so that when you actually go and create your variants, they're all kind of ready to go. This is a total power user move, and I was blown away when I saw him doing this.
Cool. All right, and so we're going to actually call this one disabled since that's what it would be in HTML there. So now we've already set up our states, we've set up our priority. Now we can go in and we can set this up where, we want to say anything here without an icon. So this is a bit of the housekeeping that you're setting up for you as a maintainer that will ultimately create a better experience for consumers. So here we're going to take this one with icon. Oh, I should match that first. Icon, and we just did icon B as a shorthand, and it's going to be false because we have no icon on there. So we're going to set that to false. We'll do it again with icon A and set that to false. And then Jacob, are you doing the others there? It looks like you're selecting some.
Yeah, I'm going to try.
All right. Are you doing the after? I'll do the
Yeah,
before. All right. So then we'll rename these to icon B is true. And then we'll also set it to match the icon A as false on this one because there is no icon after it. And if I expand this out here, we can see we have icon B is still set to true on these. So let's go ahead and just update these real quick here as well. And then we should be all set. So just taking a look here, it looks like we have everything here. Everything's looking good in our naming there. So now if we were to go ahead and do a shortcut and say, great, let's create a component set out of all of this. So two ways we could approach this. We can do it where we do every single thing like this, and we can do the shortcut then to create a component set. And if we look, hey, look at that. All of our naming is already being set up for us. And it's already telling us that it's a button component from how we named it. We could also decide, and we might not want to do it where it's one giant set like that. We might just want to do just the primary button and just the secondary button. We might want to do it this way and then rename this to primary or secondary. Jacob, curious your thoughts. I know you can really do both ways. One is more aligned to code, other is more aligned for consumption.
So this is really going to be a decision that you as a design system manager are really going to want to make depending on the design system that you have. One thing that I really like to do as a design system manager is to optimize the search experience when you're searching for components that are there. So when I search for a button, I don't just want one button to show up in that assets panel. I like to have around 10 of them there so people can visually pick what type of buttons they're using and to have the most common ones that are present. So what I would say is that if these are the only two buttons that I have in my design system, I would split these up so we can see both the secondary button and the primary button when you search for button in that assets panel. But if I have, say, 13 different hues, but all of which have a secondary button that's there, then I would do all of these as a set so that when you're searching for them, you just see the actual primary button that's there.
Cool. So we'll kind of fast forward a little bit here. We've kind of created our very first set here. But if we take a look, just as Jacob was saying there, we could really decide what's it going to be. You can set it up either way. What that looks like for your teams using that component then, if we do it the first way that we've done it, where here we just drag it out, and this one's a different one we did here. We could do it here in creating just dragging out the primary or just dragging out the secondary. We can do it that way. Or, absolutely, we can do it this way as well, where if we take, I keep hitting my wrong key on my keyboard here. If we just bring out this instance here, we can bring it out this way and we can start to change things here. So that's just a little bit on getting started on creating the component architecture. One thing I do want to say, so we talked a little bit about, do you build it out this way where, you're starting to create a variant for each thing, or, do you create a base component? There's times where it may make sense to create a local component that's used within your component sets. If we take a look here at our inputs here and our dropdown, for example. So we've done a little bit of a mix here where, our inputs and our dropdown, we've created the variant for everything. This one, we've done a little bit more work. We've included like our focus visible state on here. We have, our active, we have our error states on here. But then we've also built what that drop-down menu is. And in this case, we want to make it easier if we ever change the menu item. So we created a component set for the menu item with a couple variants on it here. We prefixed it with an underscore. You can also do the same thing with a period. This will make it so it doesn't publish out. And it's the same kind of concept as a base component. In this case, it does make sense to use it if we're building this drop down here. If I were to go ahead and select this and I want this to be, hover, maybe I want to change this to be violet. So I can change it in one place instead of going into every instance in here and updating it. This is a use where you may find using a local component helps. So there are times it can help you. There's times where you can get way too complex and start to cause headaches for folks who consume, and they may lead to a lot of detaching. So, which, detaching is not all bad. I will say it, it's not all bad. But one thing that I'd like to, I think this is a great segue for us to introduce our guest today to talk a little bit about component architecture as well. Our special guest today, Joey Banks. You may know Joey for putting out great community assets, as Jacob said at the beginning. Joey's currently a product designer at Twitter. And if you follow him, you may have seen some buzz lately around component architecture, base components, variants, all of that. So good morning, Joey. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Chad and Jacob. Thanks for having me. It's fun to be here, and yeah, I love talking about this stuff. And yeah, it's really cool to be on the other side this time.
Awesome. Well, Joey, I think probably my big question is, as we started to build out our very first component here, and just some of the practices we've picked up along the way, curious your thoughts as the way you've approached building components, and what your thoughts are there.
I guess I have a couple. So I mean, the first thing, right, is like there is no right or wrong way with this sort of stuff, and I actually think that's kind of the most fun part. It's like why we're on the call today. It's like why we're able to talk about these things, and it's just fun to like feel out and see how everyone is kind of doing things, right? And so I think that depending on the situation and depending on the design system, depending on the team, depending on the individual, like workflows can and should totally change. And the other thing I was actually thinking about as you were all presenting is, Figma changes a lot, right? Like I was thinking back to the day where styles didn't exist, and I was creating components for all of my paragraph styles and all of my text styles. And that felt really advanced and really like it worked really well, right? But now today with styles like that it would still work, but it'd be a pretty convoluted way to do something like that. And so I think it's kind of cool to have these conversations and just to like reevaluate and just to hear from the community, like how are people building these things and how are we like creating these things to do our job, to help others do their job. That's what I find really exciting. So yeah, I could talk about this for a few hours, and I'm excited to talk about it for 30 minutes with all of you today though.
Awesome. Well, I know that, one thing, and even as I was first starting to learn, Joe, I know that you provide some great guidance for me as I was first starting to learn. And I definitely explored that base component route as well. And then I started to unpack the variants. And I know you recently wrote a really great article on that and how your approach has changed. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what led you to that.
Yeah, of course. And I typed up some notes here just because I don't want to forget anything. But so I think the first thing to kind of talk about, right, or to think about is what I said at the start. Everything is different. And you might be on a team that's creating a design system. So you might have like a top library with a lot of like structural elements and just kind of like core UI that you want to use on multiple different platforms, whether it's mobile or desktop or iOS or Android, or things that are just distinctly different, but they might pull from the same design tokens, or they might pull from the same kind of core pieces of UI. And so in that case, I think it's perfectly fine. And this is all just my experience, but it's worked well to publish things at that top level file, and then to kind of receive those in a secondary design library to use those elements, to use those components or those styles, and then publish out again. So you're kind of creating like a 2-tier structure. At first, it's definitely a little complicated, right? But when you think of the idea of, well, if I have like a library for A, B, and C, and they all need to pull from that top level, or they all need to pull and use some of the same components, that idea of managing the same components and the same styles 3 separate times is really overwhelming and kind of scary, especially as you think about like, well, if something changes, like now I'm responsible for 3 times that work. And if I mess it up in one spot, it's going to be quickly different. And so I think that approach is perfect. And if it works well, absolutely keep doing it. And so that's just kind of what I wanted to start off with. And so the whole concept of base components, I think to everyone, including myself, it means a different thing on a different day, right? And so the definition always changes. And for me, it's been this idea that I started using well before variants were introduced in Figma. And the concept is like, hey, if you want to create a button, you might create a structural button that essentially has like the frame around it and the content inside and maybe an icon or whatever possibilities could be possible. And in that structure button, you would kind of hide those elements. And then you would basically take that component, duplicate it so you have an instance, and then create a new main component out of it. And then you would create instances of that main component, if that makes sense. And so the whole idea there that we're all probably familiar with is, well, if you change something in one spot, it's going to change everywhere. So if you adjust the border radius, it's going to adjust the border radius of all of your buttons, which is technically like kind of cool, right? Just to be able to like control components in that flow. And so I was doing that for a while, and I thought it was working really well. And I was definitely kind of on the teams that I was working with, or even my own work and my iOS kits, I was definitely embracing that a lot. However, I think there was one component in particular, if anyone has used the iOS kit that I created, it was the table row component. And in iOS, this is like if you go to the settings app and you see any of the long list there of items, it's basically that component. And I was creating that and I was using a base component, and I was just like, wait, I don't know if this really makes a lot of sense. And so this kind of leads me into my points of maybe why I'm personally just kind of backing away from them, or maybe not relying on them as often. And so the first thing that really causes a bit of upfront work is, I talked about that button earlier, right? And if for a complicated component, you want to use a base component model, you have to basically create every possible scenario as hidden layers inside of that base component. So if you have a table row with 32 different extrapolations or options, you have to create all of those, hide those, and then turn those on for each of your variants, right? And it is a really cool thing, because if you're like, oh, well, actually, I just want to swap that icon out, or I want to adjust that toggle 2 pixels to the left, you can just do it in the base component and you're all set, right? However, managing all of that in that first component and managing all of those hidden layers and then propagating them downward to the actual component that's going to be served out in Figma is really tough. And like that work cognitively adds up. And in my own experience, it just creates a lot of kind of overhead and complication up front. And it almost prevents, at least for me, it almost prevents me from wanting to like build or move forward with something because it's so complicated to do and I just kind of put it off, right? And so that's kind of the first point. It's just like, wow, that's a lot of upfront work to do and to make sure that you're maintaining a lot of those hidden layers. The second thing that I kind of wanted to bring up is this idea of usability. And I'm not the first to say this, it just was something that really clicked with me. And so if we think about the whole hidden layers aspect, and then we think about variants in Figma, imagine you're a designer working with an instance that references a base component. And because you're using that instance, you have the ability to see all of those hidden layers inside of the base component, right? And so you can see that icon that's turned off, or you can see that switch that's turned off, and you absolutely have the ability to go in and just, unhide the layer, just like we would. But because we're using variants, most components are using variants. Now, all of a sudden, if that layer is turned from hidden to visible, the component or the instance no longer matches the variant selection on the right-hand side, right? And that's okay if it definitely is a little bit complicated, but it kind of, for an engineer who is maybe inspecting that component in Figma and looking at the inspect panel and seeing like, all right, what properties are enabled here? Well, if you have a mismatch between the visible layers and the actual variants themselves, it adds some complication. Um, and the other thing that I was kind of thinking about is just, like it's very cool to say like, oh yeah, if I want to adjust the border radius, right, I can do that. Or if I want to like, up the text size, I can do that really quickly. But the thing that I think I needed to ask myself was like, how often are we really doing that as design systems designers? Are we kind of creating those things because they're cool and like very awesome to do, I think, and take a lot of work and will make our life down the road easier? Um, but is that at a cost to anyone who is actually using the design system and using those components? Is it adding additional complexity? And I shared this in a tweet a little while ago, and I want to make sure I say his name right. John Toman. He said something really concise and really clear that I thought was excellent, but it was just replying in this and saying usability over maintainability, right? And so that is prioritizing the end designer's experience with the instance and with the design system over the design system designer's experience of creating and maintaining the component. And I think both are equally important, but I think if the design system needs to be adopted and used and relied on, then the usability matters quite a bit. And so doing anything you can to kind of make that easier really, really helps. Yeah, thanks. Vanessa just linked his talk and I appreciate that. It covered a lot in there. And so this is kind of just me taking that talk and thinking of my own experience and kind of putting thoughts out there. One thing that I always bring up to people when we kind of talk about this is Figma has some really great options to allow you to kind of alleviate some of the added work that might come from moving away from base components. And in the quick menu, the quick actions menu, command /, if you type in select all, there are a number of options that you can actually select there to make life a lot easier. So if you want, for instance, to change the border radius of all of the instances like the one that you have selected, well, you can just go in there and type in select all with same instance and then adjust them. Or if you want to grab all of the text that matches the text that you have selected, again, you can type in select all with same text properties. And so there's like just a number of things in there that we think are hard to change later, but it's actually pretty easy given how much you can really do in Figma today. And so that is something I really rely on to kind of, again, circumvent the work that I feel like might come by not using base components. And the last thing I'll say, I know this is a lot here, but these are kind of the thoughts. The last thing that I'll say is like maintenance, right? And so I experienced this a lot when it was like, if I'm building a really complex base component with 32 hidden layers, if I find a mistake in one of those states, well, in the base component, I need to go in and I need to adjust it and make a change. And so that means going in and turning that hidden layer to visible and then adjusting so I can actually see what's going on there. However, by turning that layer visible, I've now broken most of the instances that have hidden layers, right? Because now they're all showing a hidden layer is visible. I know we're saying those words repeatedly. Hopefully that makes sense. And so you just get into a thing where it's like you have to be really careful to make sure that you're turning on and off the exact right layers and being really careful when you publish out. Otherwise, if you have a layer that was turned from hidden to visible, it's going to affect every single component. And it's going to very easily break the design system. And just in general, I think this idea of like, the usability, it's like when you're only dealing with the layers that are there because they need to be there based on the variant that you're selecting, it just makes life a little bit easier, I think, for the end designer, to only be able to see like, oh yeah, I'm using a table row and it only has a switch because I'm on the variant that has a switch versus I'm using a table row, it has all of these hidden states. I don't know if these are meant to be hidden or if I should turn them on. It just kind of adds general complexity. And so I'll take a break from talking. I hope all of that made sense. But those are kind of my thoughts and just my experience so far of how I've built many of the components in the design system in the iOS kit today, and would love to get any thoughts from you too on that.
Joey, that was amazing. Thank you for touching upon all those amazing points that were there. Things that really stood out for me is you were mentioning that engineers are users too of these design systems. And we really do, as design system architects, have to consider that there's all skill levels that are there when consuming these components. And so if you're looking at that trade-off of usability versus maintainability, opt for that usability. There are a bunch of advanced tools in Figma that will really help you maintain things anyway, even in large variant sets that are there. I do want to jump into our Q&A session as we've only got about 12 minutes left here. So let's jump into some questions. Chad, you want to figure out so you can jump in?
Yeah, Jacob, I think right as we're bringing that up, while I'm bringing up our questions here, would love to also just throw it to Joey for a quick, very 30 seconds. We know you're speaking at Config this year. Give us that quick 30-second pitch. Like, what are you going to talk about? Like, let's hype this up.
TBD. No, I'm just kidding. I'm really excited about this, and I can't wait. It's definitely been a dream, and so I'm going to be talking about the thing that makes me most excited, which is making the things that help others do their thing. And it's kind of why I fell in love with design systems and why I love like speaking about things like this, because I think the real magic comes from the job of helping to create the things that help others do their best work, right? To be as confident as they possibly can in a design critique, or to push something out there to know that is right, that matches code, or to allow like non-designers to really come into a file and create things with the design system. And so I really want to talk about my experience for creating for the community, creating for a large design system like Twitter, and just how that love kind of plays into both, and share some of the similarities and differences there.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, Joey, definitely thank you for joining. Feel free to hang out for some of the Q&A. If there's anything that you want to chime in on as well, hey, we'd
sure, yeah, I'm happy to.
Love to hear. So let's take a look at some of the questions that we've got today. All right. So when is the perfect time to bring developers into the design system conversation? Jacob, I think that you were just starting to touch on this one a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking about developers actually like inspecting these things in Figma itself. And you really do have to consider that whole handoff process that's there. I would bring them in earlier rather than later. Right when you're starting to make these components and you're finalizing on things, bring your developers in there, get a just sense check of just like, hey, does this make sense to you? And the other reason why you really want to bring them in as you're making those components is you really want your variant property names to match what you're going to have in code. And so if developers are working in a silo and you're working in a silo, you're going to end up in the situation where your design docs and your developer docs are in entirely different places. So work together as you're making components, have them make components as well, just so those things are really aligned. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and I'd even add to that, even thinking back to our very first session where we started just doing the interface inventory, including your developers, your PMs, any stakeholders in that process as well, because everyone has a different perspective on the things that they tend to focus on. You get a much more complete picture. So even including developers in that very beginning process, they can help discover things that you need to be thinking about as you're creating your design systems library assets. Awesome. Let's see what else here. Oh, we have a question specifically for Joey right off the bat. Awesome. Joey, how would you recommend approaching multiple brands, products, teams, wanting their own kits, but needing to hold them to certain component standards like sizing, content, etc.? Would that be an appropriate time for base components?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I absolutely think so. And I hope I answered a little bit of this at the start, which is, I think it's perfectly really good model to create a design tokens file and like a top level design systems file that kind of feeds downward to other brands, other products, other devices, other platforms. And in Figma, I think that's the best way to kind of think about like, what does a tree structure look like, and how do you reduce the number of overall components and work that you have to maintain, but how do you kind of get the maximum usability out of those? And so, yeah, and also just like try what works. I'm no one to say like, hey, absolutely don't do that, or definitely don't use base components. But I do think like splitting things out into multiple files as often as you can, as it relates to like user needs and designer needs, it has definitely been a really positive experience. So I hope that helped.
Yeah, and I'd say that's a question that our team gets a lot, as well as how do I approach multiple brands or even multiple mediums? What if I have one library for iOS versus web versus Android, etc. And yeah, I mean, a lot of that, it really is what works best for your team. There's no one way this is the way to do it. All right, let's see. Is there a reason why your team decided to name your component library Sticker Sheet? Great question, Jess. So I think we're just very early on. We're just building right now. We're just starting to get into components. One thing that I've found in working on systems in the past is even before I get into thinking about what the final library is and distributed, get everything built out in sticker sheets and just distribute those as things teams can copy and paste from, just to see if it fits into the designs that they're working with. That's kind of just a very quick, easy way to get started with it.
Chad, real quick, I was just going to add on this one. I think sticker sheet can actually be a really helpful term. It's obviously a little bit legacy, I believe, with some of the prior tools, but sticker sheet kind of implies too that it's like, this isn't where main components are living. These are components that are meant to be, updated and then therefore kind of copied and pasted out. In a lot of ways, I think that sort of thing is kind of a really helpful model if you do have like areas that you're not necessarily adding new components to, but you're kind of pulling new components into from another library. So that's something that's really resonated with me in the past.
Yeah. Jacob, I don't know if you have thoughts here as well, with what you've worked on in the past as well.
Yeah, I mean, sticker sheets, as we mentioned, which is starting out point, it's just really where you're just grabbing one thing and dropping it into the other. I find this is definitely industry jargon that's there, and it's a more standardized one that's present. It doesn't really matter what you're naming this. It's really more the concept that's there is that you're starting a little bit scrappy early on and be able to copy those things and drop them in places.
Cool. All right. Let's see, we have anonymous question here. Is it wise to build out a structural component for each different types of components like buttons, radios, inputs, etc.?
Yeah, I can field this one. I feel like this is really going to be dependent on how you use these components and think about that in context. As we mentioned earlier, like there's definitely situations where a base component makes sense. If you're having like a dropdown that's there and you just switch different items inside of that dropdown, yeah, I would use a base component there for each of those menu items that are present. But would I make one for every single component that I'm making? No, if I can solve it in just a slightly larger variant set, I would take that approach just because it's going to make it easier for consumption. It's going to make it easier for inspection, and it's going to make it easier just for everyone that's actually using your design system library, and it's going to accelerate their work. So try and optimize for that consumption as much as possible, and only use those structural components when you think it really makes sense for the architecture and it'll improve the usability of it.
Absolutely. Great. Let's see. What is one of the most common avoidable mistakes you see in design system when starting from scratch?
Ooh, I can take this one real quick, or just to provide a little bit of perspective.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier now that you can move components from one file to another. But I think the biggest mistake that I've made in the past is not necessarily doing enough upfront thinking about what you want these design libraries to, where you want them to exist in your Figma instance, right? And so I don't think that for most teams that every single component should be in a single file. I think that it probably makes sense to break them out into different files. That way you can turn on or off those libraries as needed, and you only see the relevant components. And I definitely have made this mistake before of just putting everything in a single file and then having to go back and back in the day weren't able to move components from one file to another. Now it's definitely a little bit easier, but I would always recommend just putting in that upfront work if you can, of just thinking of like, what do you want the layout of your Figma instance to be and where should things live?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. And I think one thing I'd add on as well is sometimes it's just like we want to over-engineer and over-design things and put in every single possible option, even if it's something that might only be used in one obscure place by one team. Like, does that necessarily need to be in your library? Not necessarily. Even thinking of how Jacob and I broke down all of our examples, like we purposely didn't bring a stepper in because we realized it was used in one place. So did we really need to create a component for it if it's only in one place? Probably not, especially starting out. We can always add later. Awesome. So I'm going to take one last question here before we wrap up, and let's see. What's better if you are working on a huge project with loads of different features within loads of different components and styles? To have one huge design system or to have smaller? Yeah, I think that Joey just kind of summed this up as well. It's any time that there's a way to break it up and make it more focused, it really leads to a better consumption experience. Um, I'd say also thinking in Figma where you might have some of these that are only specific to certain teams. So as you have those libraries broken up, you can enable libraries for specific teams that would consume those assets rather than just dump everything on everyone within the organization.
Totally. And I would really like focus here on if you have too many things that actually surface when you're searching for components, you're entering into a lack of usability by providing more components that are there because you're providing this like paradox of choice. It also means you may end up in situations where you don't have as consistent of a design system.
Awesome.
Alrighty, I think that's all the time that we've got for questions. Thank you all so much for joining. It was an absolute pleasure having you all here. Joey, thank you so much for joining as well. Very excited for your config talk.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And both myself and Chad will also be there at config. I have a talk. Chad will be working with the speakers there as well as possibly hosting. We will find out. Yes, if you have any further questions or have feedback or anything else, please go to either help.figma.com, friends.figma.com, or forum.figma.com to really engage with us. We really value all the feedback that each of you have. We also have a few things that we just want to mention here. There's going to be future live streams that you can sign up for at figma.com/events. In addition to that, config registration is now live. So if you're excited to see a lot of these things we talked about way more in depth and also see what the future of Figma is, please go sign up now and join for that actual config launch and live stream and all the talks that are there. And lastly, if you have suggestions or ideas, feel free to reach out to all of us at community@figma.com. Thank you, everyone. This was so much fun. We will see you in the next episode.
Thank you, everyone.